Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us today. We have very different time zones here with us. So I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us today from different parts of the world. Just by the ones we are aware that are here, we have time zones starting from 6:30 in the morning. So we thank Steve, Professor Harold from the University of Washington for being here with us today so early. And we also have Professor Yu speaking from Shanghai, so on the very opposite time zone. And we have Marco in the middle speaking from Brussels, so all time zones available with us here with us today. So thank you very much for being here. My name is Larissa Varholz. I'm a senior fellow at the Brazilian Center of International Relations, CEBRI. I'm here joined by my also colleague at CEBRI, Minister Isabella Teixeira, a trustee emeritus at CEBRI, who's also joining us here today, not only as a CEBRI member, but also as a commentator to our event. So thank you all for being here. We would like to thank you all for accepting CEBRI's invitation for being here today. The topic of our event is China's ecological history and paths towards sustainable development. We have a very interesting panel today, and I'm sure this is going to be a very enlightful discussion as part of CEBRI's China Analysis Group. Which is a historic series of discussions on China, its region, and its relations with Brazil, organized in partnership with the Chinese Bank of Communications, BOCOM BBM. This event that we're hosting today is also developed in partnership with the Environment and Climate Change program of CEBRI. So we have the two units of Asia and Environment and Climate Change working together today to present you, to bring you this event. Given that the topic puts together these two big challenges, a look at what China is doing on that front and how the ecological history of China has been developing, and how that affects also our relation with China, our bilateral relations. So this webinar will explore China's transformation since 1949 from an ecological perspective, which is quite unique look developed by Professor Harold. Normally we look at the recent history of China from an economic or political perspective. So it's very original and unique to have this look today from an ecological perspective. And we will examine China's ongoing efforts to emerge as a global environmental leader, highlighting that there is a lot of progress being made, but there are also persisting ecological challenges ahead. So to this end, and for that discussion, we will be joined by Professor Steve Harold. Steve is the author of a number of books and publications, and his most recent book, which is the focus of our attention today, is called An Ecological History of Modern China. It was just launched in July this year by the University of Washington Press. The participants will receive a link to his book on the chat, so you can check that out. And Steve is an ethnographer and interdisciplinary environmental scholar focused on China and Taiwan. He retired in 2017 after 43 years at the University of Washington. He is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Environmental and Forestry Sciences. Since retirement, he has been writing about the ecological history of the People's Republic of China as well as working on sensitive climate change mitigation and adaptation policies in Whatcom County, Washington. So Steve will present his book to us today, and following his presentation, we will have comments from 3 commentators who are joining us today, and I'll briefly introduce them so I don't have to also go over their bios later on. But we will have Marco Cabral, who's a career diplomat and is currently the Chief of Staff of the Climate, Energy and Environment Secretariat of Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the leading unit at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil looking after these topics of climate change and environment. He used to be the head of the division responsible for climate change at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil between 2019 and 2020. And he was also responsible for climate change and the environment at the Brazilian Embassy in Beijing in 2009 to 2013, and at the Brazilian mission to the European Union. Additionally, he participated in a number of COPs, COP 9, 10, 11, and 25, the COPs of the Climate Convention. And he is currently speaking from Brussels, where he is defending his PhD thesis on human rights this week. We also have Professor Yu Hongyuan joining us from Shanghai, who is professor and director of the Institute for Public Policy and Innovation Studies at the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. He is an honorary fellow of the Center for International Energy Strategy Studies at Renmin University of China, a visiting fellow for Sustainable Developmental Research Center of the China Academy of Social Science, and an honorary fellow of the Center for Asian Pacific Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Professor Yu obtained his PhD from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and a master's degree from Renmin University of China, which is my own alma mater in Beijing. From 1998 to 2000, Professor Yu worked with the Administrative Center for China's Agenda 21 at the Ministry of Science and Technology of China. Yu Hongyuan is the author of numerous publications, including Global Warming and China's Environmental Policy in Nova Science Publishers. And then finally, we're very happy to be joined by Isabella Teixeira. Minister Isabella is a trustee emeritus at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI, and a board member of the Brazilian National Development Bank, BNDES. Isabella Teixeira is a biologist, and she holds a PhD in environmental planning, environmental policies, energy, and climate change. Isabella was Brazil's Minister of the Environment between 2010 and 2016, when she led the Brazilian delegation in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement in 2015 and the Nagoya Protocol in 2010. She was also a key leader of the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012. Isabella is very involved in initiatives related to the United Nations, and as such, she co-chairs the International Panel on Natural Resources of the UN, and she's a member of the UN think tank, United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, TESA. Isabella works as a consultant to the private sector and to national and international philanthropy institutions, and in 2013, she was awarded the UN Environment Award Champions of the Earth for her international political leadership. So I will now give the floor to Steve. And so the audience knows they will have a chance to also interact with participants, and they are welcome to share questions on the chat. So we'll have a time for debate afterwards. If you have any questions in mind, you can type them anytime on the chat, and we will make sure to ask them at the debate time. Thank you very much, Steve. The floor is yours.
Obrigado. Antes de começar, quero dizer duas frases em português. Sou muito obrigado a todos que facilitaram este evento. Pido desculpa para não falar português. Agora falo inglês. I'm very happy to have this opportunity, and without wasting any more time, I will try to share my screen to begin the presentation. And if you can see that.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. This book, An Ecological History of Modern China, is an attempt to do two things. The first is to rethink Chinese history, as Larissa said, in ecological terms, but also to use history to understand China's current environmental situation and China's current role in the world environment. In order to do this, I've used or borrowed or developed some key concepts that combine a theory from systems ecology with concerns about ecological and environmental developments in China. There are several of these, but in the interest of time, I'll just introduce three key concepts. The first concept is what the great physical anthropologist James Wood from Penn State University calls the Malthus and Boserup ratchet. You all know that Thomas Malthus explored the relationship between population and land and productivity of a society, and posited that with a constant technology, a society's population would outgrow the resources which it could use, and the population would first expand as the society was in what he called a situation of plenty, and the resources being inadequate at that level of technology, it would descend into a condition of misery. Then Esther Boserup, the great Danish development economist, said, but when this happens, in fact, the society will increase the inputs, not of land, because that's constant, but of either labor or invent a new technology and overcome the limitations of the previous technological regime, and the society would go into plenty again. But then, of course, they would exhaust the possibilities of this technology. So James Wood called this Malthus and Boserup ratchet, by which the society goes through successive stages of increased intensification, increased inputs, and temporarily increased results, a situation of plenty, but then exhausts the possibilities and goes into misery again. And China has experienced many cycles of this across its history. And I use this as a way of understanding several cycles during the People's Republic. The second concept is one that I've developed, which is a trade-off between productivity and resilience. If we think of the resilience of an ecosystem defined as its ability to absorb disturbances or shocks or perturbations from the outside and still continue its functioning, then at very low levels of productivity, often changes in technology or greater inputs will actually increase the resilience at the same time. And the most obvious instance of this, for example, is if you're farming on a steep slope and then you lose a lot to erosion. If you clear a steep slope and start farming on it, you lose to erosion. Crops are unreliable. It's very difficult to get up and down that slope. You build terraces, which is an intensification. It takes more work, it takes more input, it takes more maintenance, but you actually increase the resilience of the system, of a terraced hillside over the steep slope. But this positive relationship between resilience and productivity lasts only a short time, because, or only for part of a cycle, because if you intensify too much, you depend too much on certain technology, or you depend too much on certain social relationships, and productivity continues to go up, but resilience starts going down, and the system becomes more fragile. It becomes more susceptible to outside disturbances or shocks. And we see this over and over again in Chinese history, including modern history. And the final concept I'll talk about is what I call the fix to fix the fix, which is that often, and this is particularly true, I think, in China historically, that you build some kind of infrastructure in order to increase productivity of a system. For example, you build a dam in order to generate power, to provide water for irrigation, to prevent floods. But the dam itself brings about certain environmental harms, a certain environmental degradation and with the Sansha Dam, the Three Gorges Dam, we can list these, and I do in the book. But the response to the environmental harms that something like a dam or something like an urbanization system causes is not to remove the cause, but to build some other usually infrastructural input. And so I call this the fix to fix the fix. You build something to fix something, and then it causes problems. And rather than remove the cause, you build something else. So the fix to fix to fix. These are some of the concepts that I think makes it possible for us to understand both the undoubtable fact that China has increased its productivity by many times since the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, but in many ways, its environment has become more vulnerable, less resilient to various shocks. And the recent continuous, almost continuous, not continuous, but the recent frequent and serious floods in many parts of China are not simply due to climate change, but due to the fact that China has built a lot of infrastructure which helps increase productivity, but decreases the resilience of local and regional ecosystems to climate disasters. So I want to go through the structure of the book. I first start out with a tour of China's social ecological systems. And because China, the boundaries of China are basically a result of the boundaries of the Qing Empire as they stood when the Qing entered the world system of based on nation states. China is not a single ecosystem, but includes three major ecological zones. So I call these China proper, which is the dark area in the map, which is the densely populated part of China, which includes a population historically based on ethnically Han Chinese farmers who provided a surplus for the cities, the bureaucracy, the army, and the ruling classes of China, both during the imperial period and in fact now. In the southwest of China, we have the area that Professor James Scott, in his book, The Art of Not Being Governed, called Zomia. He borrowed this from a Dutch scholar called Willem van Schendel. But this is an area of much less population density, shifting agriculture, and for many peoples there, avoidance of state power. The north and northwestern part is what I call Chinese Central Asia, which is very sparsely populated because of a dry climate, unsuitable for agriculture in most of its areas, and inhabited historically by nomadic peoples from the Xiongnu in the time of the Han Dynasty to the Mongols, Tibetans, Kazakhs, and other nomadic peoples who live there today. And the ecological changes that have happened over the course of Chinese history, over the course of People's Republic history, have affected these three zones very differently. The boundaries between the zones are fuzzy, which is why the colors sort of bleed into one another. And the second thing that I do in the book is try to talk about how to periodize, divide into periods, the history of the People's Republic. Conventionally, as Larissa outlined in her introduction, we see China from a political perspective, and the divisions of history are based on policy. And so we go from what people call Maoist or high socialism or the planned economy, with a big shift in 1978 with 改革开放 and the post-Mao reform and opening. These are the main divisions. And then, of course, the subordinate divisions we see from the building socialism to the Great Leap Forward, to the so-called moderate interlude, to the Cultural Revolution. And then perhaps some people talk about the advent of the Xi Jinping administration as a kind of a new authoritarianism. This is a way that conventionally we think about Chinese history. But if I want to think about it in ecological terms, the periods come out a bit differently. I divide this in, also it's actually a policy division. The early period, all the way until 1998, I would call developmentalism, where the object of state power and state policy is to increase the economic output and the physical well-being of the country, with only secondary regard for the environmental changes, which may make the ecosystem less resilient. Since about 1998, and it's not a firm boundary, we moved to what some colleagues and I in a recent book have called eco-developmentalism, where the state is paying great attention to environmental mitigation and to the environmental effects of policy, and has developed, among other things, the idea of ecological civilization, 生态文明, as one of the guiding principles. Whether it's followed in practice is something we can talk about, but one of the guiding principles of policy. And one of the controversial things about this, I think, is that during this period, what I call environmentally unconscious developmentalism, the Cultural Revolution is not a particularly distinctive period from ecological perspective. The Great Leap Forward certainly is. It's a total ecosystem collapse and great tragedy. But the Cultural Revolution ecologically mainly continues the policies of before and after the Great Leap Forward, and is not a major influence on the ecosystem. So that's a very brief outline of the temporal structure of the book. And then I tell the story from 1949 to the present. I tell the story twice. The first, I tell it in the part that I call Land, Water, and Food, which goes through and shows the relationship between China's growing population from about 600 million in 1950 to 1.4 billion today, and the way that the economy, the agricultural economy and agricultural infrastructure has managed to feed that population, not just feed the population, but feed it very well. And also all of the ecological changes which have happened during that process of growth of food and material supply. Then I go back and I tell the story again about from the standpoint of industrialization and the growth of cities, and end up with the paradox that, well, whereas China's economy is much, much more energy efficient, much less energy intensive than it was a long time ago, nevertheless, its usage of energy, its usage of other resources, and not coincidentally, its greenhouse gas emissions are greater simply because the output is so much greater. So it's much more efficient, but it's also much more, it has much greater carbon emissions and much greater other environmental effects. Now, from a book that has this kind of structure, I have some general insights that I would like to share, and I would particularly like to hear Minister Isabella and others comment on these insights. The first thing is that resilience of an ecosystem is knowable only in retrospect. In other words, we don't know how resilient an ecosystem is, how able it is to absorb disturbances until we've had the disturbances and see whether it absorbs them or not. Most of the predictions of disaster have not come about. And at the time of the Great Leap Forward, there was no particular prediction of disaster. And of course, there was a disaster. So resilience is not really something that we can know in advance. The second thing is that China's transformation, as I called it, from developmental state to eco-developmental state has followed the same trajectory as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. It's just done it a little bit later because its level of development was a little bit behind these other areas. But there's not really that much difference. We can look at Japan and we can see the same transformation to an eco-developmental state policy as we see in China. A third thing is that this is something that everyone knows, but it's worth bringing out. China is both the leading greenhouse gas emitter in the world and the leading builder of green solutions to environmental and climate problems. So we see politically motivated either praise or criticism of China. Well, China is the world leader in green technology. Yes, it also emits more greenhouse gases than anyone else. And it's not just, even in per capita terms now, it emits more than certain European countries. The fourth thing is there's, this is very a generalization, but a generalization that there is no generalization. There's a lot of argument in environmental policy and environmental circles, whether authoritarian regimes such as China or democratic regimes such as Brazil, the United States, European countries, are better at mitigating environmental damage. And the answer from my look at China and looking at other countries, there's no difference. There's no generalizable difference. We have to look at the specific regimes rather than saying democracy is better for the environment. And finally, China's role in international transfer of environmental degradation has gone from non-participant to importer of environmental harm to exporter. And I'd like to spend the rest of the time talking about this trajectory. From 1950 to 1978 or 1980, China was ecologically autarkic, particularly after it discovered oil here at Daqing in Heilongjiang in the late 1950s. It didn't contribute much to world environment either way, and it didn't import or export much environmental degradation. But from 1980 on, for a while, China became an importer of environmental degradation in many ways. In other words, other countries shifted their environmental harm onto China. China produced 28% of the plastic for the rest of the world, which of course the environmental harms of plastic production are something that we all know. And it also imported 70% of the plastic waste and reprocessed it until finally it cut this off at 2017. So in other words, China is degrading its own environment on behalf of other countries with whom it trades. But China turned from being an importer to being an exporter of environmental degradation, something that happens to almost all countries as they grow economically. In the first stage, and I'll go back to the telling the story in my book about land, water, and food. In the first stage, China was simply interested in feeding its own population. It imported a little bit of food, exported a little bit of food. But if we look at the graph there, we could basically see that China had a hard time feeding itself until the late 1970s. And since then has had actually a great surplus of food, if we simply think about it in terms of primary nutrients or calories. But from the 1990s to the present, China has wanted to increase not just the quantity, but the quality of its food supply. And we can see this here, that China's daily protein intake was in 1982 was 7.7 grams per person. By 2018, it was 38 grams. Brazil is 53, United States is 75. Probably the United States has too much. And so China has really improved its diet. But in order to do so, it's done things that have exported environmental degradation to other countries. And I don't need to say to a audience of Brazilians that the demand for varied food, better quality food, higher protein food, more meat, led to two things. China grew more corn to feed its own animals, its own livestock, but also imported soybeans. And lately, of course, has also been importing more corn. And this leads to the conversion to soybeans of a lot of forest land, not only in Brazil, but increasingly now in Argentina and Bolivia. Another example of this is demand for varied food. In this case, fish has led to the expansion of nearshore fisheries, fishing on the distant seas, and to degradation of coastal environments in many parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and in West Africa. Dams on international rivers are another instance of this. And the dams, particularly on the Lancangjiang, which in Southeast Asia is called the Mekong, has disrupted the fish cycles of Cambodia in the Tonle Sap Lake and contributed to the environmental problems of Cambodia. And this is something, I owe this to Marco from our discussion the other day, to talk about the positionality of the observer in thinking about the Chinese environment. If we look at China from the global south, we can think of China as an example to follow, as a source of construction aid and collaboration. As we know, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. China as a counterweight to US influence. As I understand, Brazilian policy has been to try to balance the two and try not to tip too far in one direction or the other. And the danger of dependence on China, which we've seen in many countries, most visibly in East Africa and Sri Lanka and other places. So we would look at China's environmental record and its international environmental record very differently. If we look at it from the US position, I think there's some harm that goes on here. Taking China as a rival obscures the need for cooperation, which is both regimes recognize this, but they're a little bit reluctant because they see themselves as rivals. It also reduces opportunities. And China as an example, which it is for many countries, is unacceptable to many Americans as our political divide here gets greater and greater. So that's all I will say, except that Apu Armani Jugum de Hunja Hunga Che in the Yi language. So obrigado a todos.
Obrigado, Steve. Thank you. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I will go straight into the commentators and ask them to open their microphone, starting with Marco Tulio Cabral. And please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Steve, for this wonderful presentation. Well, I start with compliments. In fact, I first took notice of your book in a podcast, which I shared with many other friends, including Larissa. I think that's how she got to you. But I really enjoyed your publication. It's a great contribution, and I agree with most of what you said. But I will, even to make it more interesting, I will take issue with a few of your statements for conversation's sake, and also because, yeah, I'm convinced of what I'm going to say, but you can prove me wrong. So as for this discussion of, well, the Chinese numbers are always superlative, and this is only natural that this is so. It's one of the largest countries of the world and used to have the largest population. Now India just overtook it, but still everything is large in China. So to say that China is the largest emitter in the world doesn't mean much, considering that it's the most populous country and so on. We have to see things in relative terms. And on that, I don't totally agree with your statements about China as an exporter of environmental harm. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me. Of course, this needs careful examination, but it is true that China's per capita emissions, for instance, are now higher than those of some European countries, but not all of them. And still they lag way behind those of the United States, Australia, and Canada. So, and on top of that, and I think this is very important, China remains the factory of the world. So again, I don't have the latest numbers, but a sizable portion of China's emissions go into products which are consumed outside China, mostly in the rich world, in the US, Europe, Canada, and so on. So I think if we were to consider whether China does export or import environmental harm, all that had to be brought on board. And probably the conclusion would be a different one if we did take all that into account. Coming to the relation with Brazil, and the issue of environmental degradation in Brazil due to China's demand. Again, on that, I would like to take issue. Yes, Brazil's exports to China, agricultural exports to China grow constantly, mineral also, but I'll focus on agriculture here, which is what you have also focused on. So our main agricultural exports to China are paper and pulp, but this is not a very controversial issue, and even the environmental impact is not significant to this conversation. But other than that, soybeans, corn, and beef. Well, it is true we've gone through a shameful increase in the deforestation in Brazil, especially in the Amazon, especially if we consider the wonderful results that we have had during the first tenure of Minister Marina da Silva, and even more so during Minister Isabella. That's when we reached the lowest levels of deforestation in the Amazon, and unfortunately after that it has grown a lot. This is all true, but the connection between that and exports to China is very problematic at least. So most of the deforestation in the Amazon, in fact, has to do with land speculation. I mean, at some point, there will be cattle growing in those deforested areas and perhaps eventually something else. But at a very low productivity, the main driver there is land speculation. These are just criminals grabbing public land and at some point in time trying to acquire legal rights to those lands. This has hardly anything to do with the types of commodities that we export to China. Well, with soybeans, it's negligible. There's been a mechanism in Brazil called the soy moratorium, which has been in place, if I'm not mistaken, for the last 20 years, or at least 15 years. And it's very effective. It's completely marginal, the proportion of soybeans that come from deforested areas in the Amazon. Even beef, there is very low productivity cattle raising in deforested areas in the Amazon. But this goes to the local market, and it's highly unproductive and not very significantly in quantitative terms. The bulk of beef production in Brazil does not take place in areas previously occupied by the Amazon rainforest, and especially those that go for export. They come from other parts of the country. You know, Brazil is roughly as large as the continental United States, that is, the United States without Alaska. So it's a very large country, and things happen on a regional logic. No, it doesn't mean that because there is deforestation in the Amazon, all of our agricultural production has to do with that. These are very, very different phenomena. So I think China has very little to do with deforestation in Brazil. It is our problem, and one that we're trying to solve. We're not proud of it, but it has very little to do with China. So I think these are my main objectives. Oh, and also, I mean, considering even considering the expansion of food or the improvement in the diet of the Chinese as an export of environmental harm, I think it's a problematic idea because, I mean, even when we do quantitative social science and we crunch numbers, etc., there are always normative choices underlying those. I mean, the questions are normative. Then you crunch the numbers, but the questions you choose, they have they always have a normative underpinning. So just as it would be absurd to think that the carbon dioxide we emit when we breathe is a contribution to climate change, well, this is our survival. So I think it's not reasonable to think of food, especially unless you're talking about conspicuous consumption, like eating Norwegian salmon in Brazil, which is transported through airplane, etc. But other than that, like basic food consumption, it's beside the point to consider that as a source of greenhouse gas emissions. This is survival. This is the basic. We should focus when we consider what is a reasonable source of greenhouse gas. We should think about things that are superfluous, that could be avoided. You can't avoid eating, or if you Chinese population used to be malnourished, so to a large extent they are just still coming out of poverty and reaching a reasonable standard of living for their population. So I don't think that's the right place to focus. If you were focusing about the Chinese billionaires traveling in private jets, it would be a different story. I don't think food is a good place to look for this type of problem. So yes, these are my main comments. And as regards bilateral relations with China on environmental issues, I think this is very promising. We've always had a very good dialogue with China. Minister Isabella knows that very well. She's a good friend of Xie Jianhua. We've always had a very good, very cooperative relationship with China on multilateral fora. But at the bilateral level, we've been trying to go further in our relationship with China for a long time. And it hasn't been possible for bureaucratic reasons. The cooperation between Brazil and China is under an umbrella of an institution called COSBAN, which is the Chinese-Brazilian High-Level Commission on Cooperation and Consultation. Well, and under this umbrella, which is presided over by the vice presidents of the two countries, there are what we call subcommittees. There used to be 10 subcommittees on specialized areas like energy, mining, agriculture, trade, and so on. But we were never able to create one on something around sustainable development, environment, and so on. But finally, this year, we managed to do that. During the visit of President Lula, we had the announcement of the creation of a subcommittee on the environment and climate change. And we were very happy to host the first meeting of this subcommittee last September. We took advantage of the Climate Week in New York, and our senior officials, including Minister Marina Silva, sat together and kicked off this new initiative. And it's a very promising initiative. There's a lot of things we can do together. We are both very relevant countries, either individually of what we do or we don't do to the environment, but also as players in multilateral negotiations. So I see a very promising future for our cooperation. So my comments are these, and I will, since I already have the floor, I will already present my question, so I don't need to come back later, but you can reply to this question whenever you want. My question is, what do you think about China's ability to meet its commitment to carbon neutrality in 2060? We know this is a gigantic enterprise. Brazil is also committed, in our case, to 2050. But, well, China has its particularities. Its energy consumption is gigantic. It does have a lot of potential in renewables, but the consumption is also as big as China, we all know. So it's not a trivial task. It will cost tens of trillions of dollars just to redo the power generation system in China. And the Chinese government usually is very serious about commitments. They don't commit to things they cannot do. But, well, even quite committed countries have failed on their commitments recently. Even Germany weren't able to meet its 2020 greenhouse gas emissions targets. People, even with the best intentions, things sometimes just turn out impossible. So I'd like to hear you on the prospects for China to truly reaching carbon neutrality in 2060. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Professor Steve, I suggest you take the questions later on. So I'll now give the floor to Professor Yu Hongyuan from SIIS in Shanghai. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's really my great pleasure and honor to be here. Actually, it's when I first come to Brazil to the Rio Plus. It's in the Rio Plus 20. At that time, when we talk about sustainable development, environment, we have very famous 5P principle: people, prosperity, planet, partnership, and peace. I think Professor Harris' book actually covered all the 5P's principles. In most of those areas, we actually have, after 1949, we make this country become peaceful, bring the peace to the China. As we know, after before 1949, we can find that before the 1949, there are always quite a lot of domestic wars, conflicts, military invasions by Japanese and other countries to China. So we can find the number one damage for global environment. It's not economic development. It's the war. It's the military conflicts. It's the nuclear weapons test. So after 1949, actually China not only become peaceful, peace. Mao Zedong brings the Communist Party brings the peace to China, and also China is the world's largest contributor to global peace and development. This is also the core principle for China, even right now. From my opinion, Professor Harris' books covers three, maybe I think have the three perspectives. First is the dynamic perspective. It's actually covers from the production to capacity to resilience, and then actually with the disasters, with the challenges, China's productivity will increase, and will also then increase our capacity and resilience toward the environmental and social and political challenges. And also, Professor Harris' books covers the dynamic from the importer to exporter. As we know, China currently is the world's largest country, not only for the world's largest country, not only for the economic side, but also for his GDP, economic and for the energy consumption. This is since the 1949, only takes around 70 years. China just jumped from that a very poor, maybe poor is the country to become the world's largest economies, and we have the 26% of global energy consumption, but also contribute about around 17% of GDP. And we also have the 32%, more than 30% of renewable energies, 31% of the wind, and 33% for the solar. and for our China's actually solar panel production, and even the battery and for EV are all actually play a very important part in the global market, which will also contribute to the global clean development. And also from this, just concerning about China for this year, we have around 140, 100, even more than 150 million gigawatt for China's renewable wind and solar install capacity just for this year. This actually we will maybe double our renewable energies in a very short term. That this also even for the EV in China's communication transport, and also we will take the global largest carbon market in just to try to cover China's from the electricity to steel, even the cement industry in the future. Since from the market approach to the technology approach, and also from from China also to make the 3R principles and environmental value, environmental education. So I have, and most of people should have the confidence for China's carbon neutrality before 2060. So, and also we actually from the, particularly when we talk about China is a export for environment, but also we should, China currently is world's largest renewable energy investors after 2018, particularly for the Green One Belt One Road building. And tomorrow China will have One Belt One Road summit. For Green One Belt One Road building from the particularly for wind, solar, hydrogen, and quite a lot. This when we talk about green development, this include not only for production market, but also the basis is the infrastructure, green infrastructure, and the electricity connectivity. So this also what we can find the dynamic for Professor Harry's book, and the second is the systematic that we can cover not only the social ecological system for whole China, but also these books have a very good details for micro level. From the villagers, for the small cases, even in Chengdu, Jiangyan, and reflecting a human-oriented perspective. And also, they has a nexus perspective for water, energy, food, for ecology, and politics, for energy development, and energy economy, and social development. This also I think that this what every country before should have to cope with, how to balance the economic development and the environmental protection, how to find the nexus solution for water, energy, food, land, and the population, particularly for the global south. I think China is not maybe China is one part of the global south. Actually, from politically and economically, and China's experience just maybe we can have some experience for the global south countries, particularly for China's very fast urbanization, industrialization, that's in very short time. That's from 20. That's for carbon neutrality. We will just in less than 30 years to make the carbon neutrality very with the fast urbanization and the industrialization. I think this is also will be maybe this solution we can make the knowledge sharing between China and all the South countries, particularly for environmental protection issues. It's not actually for China. We should and the Professor Harris' book about China and the world, particularly before the 1972, particularly before China is totally isolated by the Western countries. And it's just from the 1972, at that time, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai sent the first delegation to Human Environmental Summit in Stockholm and joined the declaration accepted for one planet and of the Earth. After that time, China became the first the countries to build the national environmental bureaucracy, and after that time, China also joined the world to just like Professor Harris' book said, China joined the world, makes open and reform policy. Because this is not from the economic side, from the politics side, but also from knowledge side. Before that, China had very little knowledge about the environment, climate change, or other things. But after that, by joining the world, we can, by the mutual learning and culture communications, particularly we send quite a lot of students and experts to the overseas. I think this book should mention about that. Even currently, our Shanghai leaders also to have the overseas studies experience in UK, and this knowledge sharing it really have China to become actually economic power, not only economic, but also currently it's a low carbon development powers. So China, we also mentioned our per capita water, energy, food. It's very low, much lower than world average. But China is we can find more than 17% of the manufacturing commodity trade come from China. And actually, particularly for the petrochemical, for the steel, for this high polluted, high carbon products manufactured mostly come from China. This also can explain why China shares more than around 30% of the carbon emissions, and with more than 26% of global energy, because we are also share most of the global high carbon, high pollutant, even like from the lithium to the rare earth processing, from the steel production. And this also actually, but China for the productivity for steel is world #1. For you talk about the coal-fired power plants, the carbon efficiency is also world #1. So this we should, and China will try our best to keep this and also we can find that China's land resources and China's have quite a lot, not only for environment, it's a climate change, but also China hold the global biodiversity summit last year, and also to help to build the global biodiversity funds to help to contribute to the global biodiversity for global occasion, like global plastics pollutions, and also China is a member of the to try to have a member of Arctic and also a member of the Antarctic Council to try our best to help to promote for the environmental protection for our north and south polars. So also we can find the considering China's land resources, economic, and also we can find water principally change. China joined the WTO after 2001, and at that time China's environmental trade. And environment and trade, China become largest commodity exporter in the world. On the other hand, China should share to share the global, actually the global carbon emissions, global environmental, global resources consumptions in the world. So this what China also to we have the very fast growth for our carbon emissions after China joins WTO, and China will make a balance. But for agriculture, for food, and China actually for try to keep the agriculture independence for our rice, and to pay, and particularly for most of those area for before 1970s, China also is a leader for green revolution. Green, not only cultural revolution, but green revolution. You can find China is the world leading country for help to increase people's life expectancy. Just in less than 30 years, from 1949 to 1970s, China just become a very good country by WHO. That we have much longer life expectancy, than all the developing countries, most of the developing countries during the 1970s. And this is what I said, is that people, prosperity, planet, and the partnership, the five P principles, and also embedded in what China's environment, the ecological, environmental history in last 70 years. And currently, I think China is the leading country for South countries for its production, green revolution, and for China's its performance is 15. And also China for all that for green development concept, green development stages, green development values, not only top down, but also from bottom up, from the communities, for the grassroots to the business. And also we have the green belt route for developing countries. All in all, in conclusion, China's development thanks for Professor Harris' books, we can find China can keep a low carbon modernization. On the one hand, we strike for the low carbon green development, ecological development. On the other hand, we should also in next 10 years, we should double our GDP, double our per capita GDP. So this we should do is that make all round of modernization. China's modernization concept covered all the perspectives, particularly environmental. And also we should work with other South countries, developing countries, for build the development community for the ecological civilization. This should be make all the levels for business, for politics, for scientists together, particularly knowledge sharing, and the new green development business sharing and investment, particularly for infrastructure building and the business. I think that when we talk about the environment issues, we should have the investment environmental issue. We should use not only the technology but also investment, and we also to try to share the knowledge, build the strong environment values, to find a solution from maybe from different cultures, like from the Brazil's culture for Amazon, from Chinese history culture, to find the solutions for low carbon modernization. So this will be the I think the biggest contributor for this book, that try to find the different contribution of Chinese from the common challenge, like environmental and climate change challenge. But also we should find the commons, find the shared knowledge, find the common knowledge for our future, for our global South countries' future, from the different perspectives. So we can find the difference from common and from the common from difference. This is, I think, these books will really help the world to learn Chinese, to have the Chinese, and also to help the Chinese to to try to share the knowledge and share our experience and to learn from the history, from the world, to also to cope with the future challenges for our modernization path. This is all for my comments. Thanks so much for this opportunity to learn this book. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yu. Thank you very much. Minister Isabella, the floor is welcome for your comments.
Thanks very much, Melissa. I think that the screen is mine on the floor. But let's see, I'm very honored to have the opportunity to dialogue with our partners here, and especially the Professor Steve. Congratulations for your book. It was really an amazing experience to read some chapters. It's more than the 500 page, so I didn't have time to read all of them, but I checked, and it is impressive. And also, it's impressive not only because of the content of the research, etc., but because it allows us to discuss not only environmental policies and climate policy, but environmental and climate politics. And this is very interesting, and consider also geopolitics. This is very interesting because we're discussing global problems. Environmental concerns means global problems today. That's why we have the triple environmental crisis, the planetary crisis, and we are discussing a new dimension. It's not a global one, it's a global planetary dimension, because we impact the nature. And that's why I like too much your first insight when you mentioned that this is knowable on universal facts. And this is very impressive, very good, because we, as the political world, used to assume some concepts from science, scientific concepts, but not necessarily observe how these concepts should be used and how we should manage these issues, consider solutions. So my first comment here, thank you very much for your book. Of course, that have different perspectives, different opinions, different impacts. We need to reread, because really it was a deep research, and it also incredible the perspective, historical perspective, bring us with the discussion to discuss with the condition to discuss the future. This is my second point. I absolutely question how we come into the future, and how we share risks into the future. And this is one question for you, Professor. How did you see that China, or the emerging economy of China, because it's the issue of the book, will deal with climate risks and our share climate risk considerable? We have different dimensions going to climate risk, consider extreme events that's happening today at national world. And you know that's happening with asymmetry. And also how, what's your experience, your research, how would you like to comment how China should come to share with global climate risk? Because this is the reality that we need to face. And it's not only the cost, and I absolutely agree with the drivers that put pressure on environment and also climate conditions in the planet, but how we share in the short-term perspective the risks. In long-term perspective, nobody knows yet. But today, it's absolutely different when we took decision by Rio 92 to have a global climate regime, that we discuss the risk as something in the future. And today, the risks are happening. You can see this, you can feel this, we need to tackle this, what's happening in my country, for example, droughts, floods, cyclones, etc., etc., etc. So people understand very well what really climate risk means today. And consider Professor Yu, I like too much because you mentioned people prosperity. How Chinese people are facing today climate risks, considering the outcomes of the political policies and also the public policy that was assumed, and how would you like to drive the challenge of development that today you mentioned in your book, the decoupling perspectives that some economists are proposing, and another ones believe that we need to degrowth, not only need to avoid. So when you go into decoupling, we have how to grow with nature, decoupling environmental impacts. And when we go into degrowth, we need to stop and rethink how humankind will come with nature to provide prosperity, but without economic development, economic growth as it used to be. So what is very interesting in this, my first point, is that I like too much the way how and I think that Tulio mentioned this, how emerging economies, meaning global south, because we are not only natural resource, countries natural resource, we are biodiverse countries. Brazil is G1 and China is part of the mega biodiverse country in the world. How the global south should come together or not, what the possibilities that we come together to deal with the global challenges. And this means that we need to move beyond green wishing, not greenwashing. It's green wishing. Everyone has the wish to be green, but it's so complex, so difficult to manage short-term and long-term perspective. And I think that you mentioned some trade-offs. And I like too much when you approach your book, the trade-offs that have to do when you go into the climate crisis or environmental crisis. So it's very important that we understand how we share risks, because we're looking forward to address less risky societies. But in the other way, we're looking forward to come together considering green perspectives. But it's not clear, for example, how we move from net zero 2050 to 2070, because we have India in 2070. You mentioned in your book about 2060 in India and China, and other countries in the world looking for to address by 2050. But in my opinion, this is really a good asset, political and economic asset. China and Brazil should come together to unlock net zero box and to make sure what the trajectory is, how we should be committed, how indeed we put this in practice, how we make this happen, consider the complexity to promote energy transition, industrial transition, food transition, people transition, because you can have the care economy, etc., etc., etc. So I think that is your book is very provocative to think about the future. It's not to think about the past. That's why I like too much to read some chapters and for the conclusion. I like too much when I read about the solutions that China was able to provide. And these, when going to air pollution, it was really well succeeded policies. But you cannot forget that we have a big challenge when we go into the future to improve the coordination between national and supranational players. And I think that this is you mentioned this in your book when you go into the supranational players and the governance challenges in China. This is very, very interesting. Brazil is the same. I think that we have a fragmented climate governance, a fragmented environmental governance, a fragmented developing governance in our country. We need to understand this better. And I think that it's very interesting when you go into this debate to understand better how China doesn't need to manage illegalities, as Marco Tulio mentioned in Brazil, that you need to come when you go to nature degradation in Brazil. Unfortunately, you have environmental crime. You have today behind not only deforestation, but the illegal gold mine itself. In Brazil, you have organized crime behind the scenes. So I'm not sure how this happens or not, or doesn't happen in China. Okay, and but this you should understand that to have the common roots of the environmental degradation, but different process, and also the challenge that you share, considering that you could be or should be solutions provided countries considering short-term perspectives and medium and long-term perspectives. I think that when you mention about degradation, I took some notes, and I remember that you have common roots when you go, for example, infrastructure degradation. It's a different process, but the outcomes are the same, or the impacts are the same. This means that you need to requalify environmental and social impacts when you go into today, because it's not only based on what's happened in the past, but how you deal with scalability, and also how we can manage, combine, connect the dots of social and environmental impacts with climate impacts. And this is absolutely different. You have different dynamics, economic, political ones, and social ones. And also it's very important because you share the same conditions, huge territories. You have 3 zones in China. In Brazil, you have 5 biomes. You didn't mention a lot about emission fishery. I absolutely agree. This is a critical issue that must be addressed internationally. It's not only, and also oceans. I go into oceans, not only plastics. Fishery is one of the critical issues that must be addressed internationally and nationally, but including organized crime. And but my feeling is that it's very interesting how indeed if we come together, Brazil and China, we have huge territories, we are solution providers. Okay, we can come. Brazil has a special condition that Marturo will agree with me, because we have peace. Consider our neighbors in South America, more than 150 years. This is a powerful asset, not only because it happened today, but it's absolutely important to facilitate how people will come together. And one point that I think that you mentioned when you have your explanation, Professor, and you go into between democracy and autocracy, I agree that to have the problems doesn't mean, okay, because you share the drivers. You have industrialization, you have agricultural development, you have energy, etc., etc., etc. But when you go to the solutions, I think that it's very important to discuss how society will come to have opportunity to have choice, okay, and also be committed and co-responsible with this choice, because this is something very interesting. Consider this century, this solutions must be provided by the societies, and you must be committed to avoid setbacks. So the political arrangement, the constructions that you need to come to make sure that you can have National Congress aligned with civil society, aligned with the government, and also with the judiciary. Make sure the commitments must come together, or must have a deal, a political deal, and to be co-responsible to implement this to avoid setbacks in the future. So for me, this is really, I don't know if I can use this word in the right perspective, but this seems sometimes a political tricky situation when you go into democracy. I was in Harvard University and I met Steven Nevesky, and I asked him about democracy of authoritarianism to deal with global challenges. And he told me that this is part of his research now, okay? And I think that's very interesting, because when you go into Western countries, what we have today together in the global triple environmental crisis is democracy crisis. And this is very interesting. At the same time, when you propose sustainable development as a concept, that China hosts this absolutely development or developmentism, that is information, it's very interesting that we took this decision in the summit in the Rio 92 conference, exactly based on one asset that was emerging at the end of last century, democracy in the Western world. And today, when we have to implement, we delayed all the actions that need to be done in the past, that need to be done. And then today you have this weakness of democracy considered the Western world. Okay, and even in your country, what's happening in Brexit, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Canada, what's happening today in France, in Spain, it's absolutely important to make sure that we can manage things, consider our choice. And I think that in China, Professor Yu made this very clear, and how the government bring people prosperity as a priority, and how people, and he recommend to go into subnational, the local level, to understand how people were impacted by this measure, and how people understand this today. And I believe that your book also provoke some debates very, very interesting concerning climate crisis and environmental crisis. The first one, the other thing that is not only innovation, and how China is a provider of one of the biggest ones in the world concerning innovation and technological development, but how science is coming as a political player. And the scientific knowledge and scientific institutions in China are so robust. Absolutely. When you go bilaterally, we have this experience here in Brazil with biofuels. I know that Larissa knows a lot about this, and how we'll come to as a solutions provider, and have, for example, biofuels for aviation, and how Brazil and agriculture, it's not food, it's agriculture, and you go in the economy of biomass, okay? The new frontiers of agriculture, how we should come together to provide solutions and to minimize environmental social impacts. And this means that, in my opinion, it's absolutely important that a country like Brazil should take decisions considering two tracks. If you're going to continue to be a commodities producer in the old way, where we try to add value, or we go into the another track, the nature-based solutions. Okay, how Brazil will deal with these two tracks, two choices, consider the future. Our economy, because you have natural resources, assets, you have biomes, you have biodiversity, you have peace, you have democracy. How Brazil will make our change, and how bilaterally Brazil and China should come together to accelerate solutions for the climate and nature crisis. So this is, in my perspective, very important, because the global south should come together, these two powerful countries. If you come together, consider COSBAR and another political arrangement, institutional arrangement bilaterally that you have, as Marco Tulio mentioned, I do believe that you can use our experience and also the historic perspectives, as you mentioned in your book, to make sure that we can tell new stories about the future together. And this is the meaning of the international cooperation bilaterally, and how this bilateral cooperation could influence in a positive way international or global cooperation. And this means that I do believe that we can and should come together based on your books and so assumptions, another one we should discuss as everything that's happened in the world, but it's really a robust research. It's amazing, really, some data and consider the past. I love history. That's why I like too much to read your book, your perspective. But there is something that I'd like to highlight when we go into the civil societies, and we go to discuss environmentalism. I think, Larissa, that nobody mentions this there, but we need to renew environmentalism if we want to face the challenges that we have today and consider the future. Okay, it's not more silos that used to operate in the past, and I think the professor, you make sure when you connect the dots and what are the numbers that emerge from China, and how indeed we should refrain things if we want to deal with short-term impacts, okay, considering that the climate crisis is happening, nature crisis is happening, they are disruptive, this is disruptive, and you don't understand the not only resilience that we know about this more in the future, but about the past, but also about disruption. We don't know a lot about this, okay, but it's happening. And also how you should go and manage better degradation, restoration. And this is something very interesting. It's not air pollution, but also water restoration. This ambition, the Chinese ambition to restore degraded areas and to restore forests is the most important global program of restoration in the world. Okay, and this is a big challenge. And Brazil now is proposing to restore the degraded area in the arch of deforestation. And this is really big challenge. Is it an opportunity for me to come together to make sure that we can operate better the outcomes considering net zero, and how to neutralize emissions considering short-term pressure, for example, because we are contracting new crises now with the wars, with the full dependence on fossil fuels. Okay, and of course that you need to understand how the new energy sources will emerge, not only solar, wind, but the green hydrogen, what is coming, how we should use this together to make sure that we can play as solutions providers. I'm like to the end of my comments, I'd like to remember two things. To have Paris Agreement, Brazil came together with China. And that's why you have Paris Agreement, because China and Brazil had the bilateral meeting in Durban 2011 after the base group meeting, and we agreed informally that it should be very important to have a new way, a new agreement, a new deal, and a new accord, global accord to deal with climate change. And Brazil proposed this in Durban, and with the support of China and other emerging economies, also European Council, all of them came on board. We are not able to have Paris Agreement if we didn't have the partnership between the United States and China. President Obama and President Xi Jinping came together, 2014, okay, a year before. And Brazil has a bilateral agreement between China and also with the United States as a preparation process for Paris Agreement. So what it means that, and also Brazil and China consider this agenda, we support multilateral systems. What I'm trying to share here is that if we're able to understand your numbers and come to international members, go to the international members again, and check and have a common base of, can share the common understanding about the problems and how we can define some solution that we can come together. We avoid some misunderstanding like Marco Tulio mentioned, considering beef production and agriculture, etc. 75% of the beef production in Brazil, they are consumed by Brazilians. It's not for international market. Okay, and consider Amazonian cattle range, it's around 30% of the beef production in Brazil. 70% of the production comes from other regions. That's why we're going to traceability and supply chains, and you can share the best technologies available in the world. We are opening a good Pandora box, if I can use this expression between quotes, because Pandora box is not good, but to make sure that you can deal with concrete data and you can really establish common routes that will be committed step by step with transparency and also coming impact in a positive way business model. And you know this is very important. That's why we have international trade and how we will avoid to be exporter of environmental degradation or importer of environmental degradation, as you mentioned very well. I understand this very well. Of course, that can debate this and consider different approach and perspectives, but this is the real problem. We need to avoid to export degradation, and we need to export protection, and need to value this. That's why traceability is so important. When you go into supply chain traceability, I like that international trade remunerates the environmental service, everything that agriculture in Brazil, for example, is able to provide today. And this is not recognized because people want to put the pressure on the negative ways and not on the positive ways. You need this pendulum movement to make sure that you can negotiate things. And I'm convinced that the Global South, and between especially Brazil and China, we have a huge opportunity to come together, to unlock the boxes or the gates that still have an idea, but not a concrete way how to come together, be committed and work together. And why this is important? Because we can not only be solution providers, but we can make strengths, the multilateral, the international cooperation, the multilateral system. And also, I think that we should discuss how societies should have choice and responsibility to take decisions and to make sure that we can run solutions short-term perspectives. Finally, I think that I like too much the idea that when you have a box, a figure that shows what's happened in the past, degradation, now have to clean up. Restore is much expensive than to preserve. Everyone knows this. But we need to translate this in political language. It's not only economic language. And I think that it's very interesting that you can use better how this new agenda that is coming, this new agenda, we don't know, but now it's becoming a new agenda as natural resource efficient use, and that will connect the dots and make sure that we can stop degradation and be committed to restore and be committed to provide solutions based, have nature as a partner and not against nature. This will come next year, a new report from 9 nations, considering the global resource outlook after 4 years. The numbers are impressive. We are under pressure. And this is a challenge for a youth professor, how we should manage things, consider scarcity, because it's easy to degrade or to use things without responsibility when you have this absolutely available. The natural resources are there, minerals, strategic minerals, etc., etc. How we should play based on scarcity. That's what's happening today, because you have a planet that will run about 10 billion people, and you don't have natural resource available for everyone. So this is a big challenge, how technologies, how economic growth, how social equalities or equity, social inequalities put apart in equity will come. How we did consider the diversity of political situations in among different societies around the world, but how China and Brazil China should come together to provoke the world in a different way and to make sure that you can play. And this means that you can be recognized as leaders, not because you want to be a leader. Okay, you have some political ambition sometimes, but you don't have a project of political power. we need to understand better how the world should recognize us, okay, consider this agenda as real leaders that are looking forward to address better life and also to preserve and protect the planet. This is really a new geopolitical dimension, how we'll deal with global planetary dimension. And we need to discuss planetary boundaries, need to go in our global common, some issues that the governments don't like to discuss. But we, as the civil society players, you should discuss and should provoke. And I hope that your new book, you try to discuss not the history, but try to discuss the future, consider China challenges and also Brazil. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My pleasure. I'm very honored to meet you and also you, Professor, you and Marco Tulio and Marisa, they are good friends. And I hope that we can come together soon to discuss the future. I'm absolutely happy to have this opportunity to meet you here. Back to you, Marisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Isabella. It was an honor to have you here in the panel. Steve, I have to ask you if we can move a little bit over the time, and if you would have 15 minutes to answer some of the questions. Your book raised so many provocations among the panelists, but we also have here a couple of questions. I would like to start by raising two of the questions, one from Marco and one from Isabella, if you agree that we go a little bit over the time, okay? So Marco asked you about your perspectives on China's ability to meet their carbon neutrality goals. That was one of the topics that we discussed here, so it would be great to hear you on that. And also, as Isabella mentioned about China's position on sharing climate risk, what is your view on the policies toward these global negotiations? Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to stay as long as people are interested, and I'm very impressed that in this event people have not been afraid to challenge some of the perspectives that I have, and I think that makes for a much better discussion. Minister Isabella says she has 10 minutes, so maybe I will address her questions first. And I'm going to be rather micro here in responding to Professor Yu's ideas about scale. The first has to do with the past as a window into the future, which is one of Minister Isabella's, I think, most important points. This book is history. It's not policy analysis. That's not my strong point. But I did an event at Harvard a week ago, and Peter Perdue, the distinguished environmental historian of China, says this book brings the importance of history back into our considerations of what to do now. And so this Minister Isabella talked about short and long-term perspectives. And I think this is very important and speaks to Marco's question about China's ability to meet its targets for 2060. I don't know whether China can meet these targets. I don't know of any country that's actually meeting its individual voluntary goals from the Paris Agreement, but nevertheless, the Paris Agreement has forced or induced almost every country into decreasing its climate emissions. Not as much as they promised, but nevertheless some, which is a good sign. Minister Isabella also brought about the contradiction, or the relationship at least, between environmental impacts versus climate impacts. And I think this is a really important area to talk about. I talk about in chapter 16 air pollution and the fact that air pollution has been dramatically mitigated since the so-called air apocalypses of 2013, 2014. China's cities' air, I've done the statistical analysis of this, is much, much cleaner than it was in 8 or 9 years ago. At the same time, of course, cleaning the air removes suspended particulate and particularly coal ash and things like that, which are, of course, a retard the greenhouse effect. So there's always a contradiction going here. But I want to talk about the question of whether at a certain point in economic development, a country does two things: transforms into an exporter of environmental degradation, as Marco challenged in his comments, and also as Minister Isabella talked about, whether it actually mitigates certain environmental harms. And you talked specifically, Isabella, about the forest deforestation problem. When I looked at the so-called environmental Kuznets curve that says that both states and populations begin to treat the environment more seriously when they reach a certain level, undefined, of economic development. I looked into this in great detail to see, looking at East Asian countries and in general, whether this worked for which aspects of environmental degradation. And I found that the two areas where China had done the best in environmental mitigation were air pollution and reforestation. China's forest area is now over twice what it was, or almost 3 times what it was at the end of the long degradation of the substantial degradation of the Great Leap Forward. And these are, in a sense, easy problems. And they're easy problems because air pollution is technologically easy to solve. All you have to do is stop polluting. It's unlike water pollution. You can stop polluting and the pollution remains in the water, particularly in the lakes, for a long time. Soil pollution is even worse, right? It's almost impossible to mitigate large areas of soil contamination on a short time scale. But air pollution is easy to solve. And if you have the political will and the goals of the state and the goals of the population are in concert with one another, then it's easy to mitigate air pollution. Now, China's air is still not perfect, but anybody who's been there in 2013 and has been there in 2018, 19 knows that there's a huge difference. The same thing, deforestation is a little bit different because it's a bit longer time scale. But this is so much in so many countries under state control, and the interests of people that have interests in deforestation, as Minister Isabella pointed out, or some, and also Marco pointed out, some criminal interests or rogue capitalist interests, and states are often, because in most countries forests are under state management, it's been easier to do. So these areas are easy to solve. Other areas, as I say, such as water pollution, soil pollution, biodiversity, which I didn't have time to talk about today, but it talks about it in the book. That's very difficult. The popular interest in the survival of various elements of biodiversity tend to be limited to what we call charismatic megafauna. People can get very excited about the giant panda. They can't get very excited about some amphibian, or some small reptile. But these are all contributors to ecosystems. So this is a very difficult one. And of course, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, you can, in fact, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's not going to be easy. And I think the commentators have all pointed out the obstacles to this. But you can't reduce the global warming that has already been brought about by the emissions that we've already had. And so this brings us around to Professor Yu's idea about high carbon products. Again, steel. I actually looked at the figures again recently, and while China produces over half of the world's steel, very little of that is exported. Of course, some of it is exported indirectly in appliances and other manufacturing products. But like like as with so much else in China's economy, there's a huge domestic market, and most of the steel and all of the cement, both of which are, on the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions, these things have all been almost entirely for domestic consumption. So I'll come back around to Marco's idea about whether we can quantify this. Is China a net exporter or a net importer of environmental degradation? And this brings about almost impossible quantitative challenge. How do you measure the impact of importing soybeans against the impact of exporting refrigerators? What's the common metric that we can use? It's very difficult. So what I'm really suggesting here is not that China is now an exporter, net exporter, but really that the trajectory of just about all countries as they get richer turns into one in which they export more. And the greatest example of China, which I didn't bring up here, is actually wood products. That China is importing so much wood from Russia and most of all, but countries all over the world, including the Solomon Islands, including Gabon in West Africa, Central West Africa, that this is something that becomes very hard to solve. But China's own forest cover has increased greatly. The same thing has happened in Japan. Japan imports a lot of wood from poor countries and preserves its own forests. They're just beautiful. So this seems to be a factor that's common to just about all countries as they achieve various levels of economic development. One other thing from Professor Yu that I specifically wanted to address is the idea of food production, of food independence, not so much with export-import or the international balance, but as Professor Perdue pointed out in his comments the other day, probably maybe the most significant thing that I describe in my book is the end of Chinese peasant farming. For 4,000 years, China has been a society where food and other agricultural materials were produced by small-scale agriculture. Yes, we had, of course, collective agriculture between 1954, 1956, and the early 1980s, but this was still mainly dependent on human labor and animal labor working small plots. A lot of people to work a small amount of land to produce the food. Now China's agriculture is becoming much more like U.S. agriculture, which is that it's I call it CCCM, consolidated, commercialized, chemicalized, mechanized agriculture. And this is the biggest ecological change and the fastest major ecological change that I think China has ever, or that the world, in fact, has ever experienced. So back to, in the end, Marco's question about per capita greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, as a U.S. person, I mean, I'm just ashamed of the U.S. and Canada and Australia are not the proper comparisons, because we are so wasteful that's a large country like China or India or even Brazil expanding its greenhouse gas emissions to the U.S. level or a Canadian level, which is actually even a little bit higher, would be shameful, would be immoral, and it would be counterproductive. This relates back to the idea of can China meet its 2060 goal? Well, the obstacle, of course, is the energy economy dependence on coal. And if you look now, that coal was almost 80% of total energy production in 1980. Now it's around somewhere in the 60% of total energy, less than that, 56% of electric power generation. This is progress in the right direction, but it runs into, again, the paradox of a more efficient but larger economy is going to have larger environmental impacts. I want to close, I guess, with coming back to the Malthusian question. Part of the thing is when I was born, 1947, we had 2.5 billion inhabitants on this planet. Now we have 8 billion. So even with the greenest possible policies and practices of economic development, our impact is going to be greater. And it's simply the paradox of even the best intentions do not always suffice to serve a much larger population. So we're not talking about praise and blame here. We're not talking about moral responsibility for population growth. We're talking about the effects of population growth, and the moral economy, the moral responsibility, as Minister Isabella has said, falls on not just states, but on populations who need to address these problems seriously. And coming together, of course, I think that there are factions in the U.S. government now, exemplified by Ambassador Kerry, whom, of course, was actually presidential candidate. People forget that, but presidential candidate in 2004, that are really committed to cooperation with China, but that there are other factions, and I think it's represented more than anything else by people who are looking at the political possibilities of chauvinism and perhaps racism against China, who are impeding the possibility of coming together. So I'll just stop here, except that I would love to continue this somehow. I don't know if we can continue by email exchange or just get together on another Zoom call without a public thing, public presentation. But I would love to continue this dialogue with all of you, and I wanted to again say, muito obrigado.
Thank you, Steve. I promise that I will connect you all by email so you can be in touch. I know that Minister Isabella has to leave, so please feel free. I just want to thank everyone for being here.
I'm sorry, I do apologize, but I have to leave now. Okay, thank you very much, professors. Bolson, my pleasure. Marturi, bom revê-lo. Boa sorte na sua tese. And thank you very much. I hope to see you soon, and let's be in touch. Okay, I think that we can share the emails, and I'm very interested to know about the next steps. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Sorry, but I have to go to the group.
Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, we will in any case end the event here as well. And I would like to thank everyone on behalf of CEBRI, thank our main author, thank our commentators, thank our audience. It was really, I was very impressed by the powerful discussion that we had. Thank you for being so provocative. And we would like to be able to indeed continue this dialogue because this is probably one of the biggest topics involved in the Brazil-China relation at the moment. There's so much potential to be further explored. We had questions here about how Brazil and China can collaborate on forests and degraded areas. I think all of these topics are of interest to both sides. So I'm sure we will have other opportunities to include you, also Professor Harald, in our discussions here in Brazil about this topic. Thank you for your contribution with your book. It's a major contribution, and we are glad to have a chance to have this interaction with you. Professor Yu, it's so late for you, and you're still here with us. Thank you very much. We're really pleased that you stayed until the end. It's 11:20 p.m. in Beijing, Shanghai time right now. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.